Hi, I want to talk to you about Aristotle and a different sort of way of teaching Aristotle. Forget all the things that happen at the moment in universities where the philosophy of Aristotle is taught, and go back in time in your mind to 19th century Oxford, where they had a very different view of Aristotle. I would say they regarded Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics as holy writ. Who do I mean by they? I'm thinking of a group of people that I have labelled the new College Aristotelians. They produced a single book. This book is called The Moral Philosophy of Aristotle. You can buy it cheaply over the internet, and it is a huge mammoth monster of a book. It includes a complete translation of Aristotle's Ethics, and it was produced because the people who were teaching the classic syllabus at Oxford at the time, and I'm talking about the 1870s, were struggling, I think, with the problem that it was just too difficult. Aristotle is incredibly difficult. Forget for the moment the difficulty of reading something in ancient Greek. Even if you were really good at reading something in ancient Greek, Aristotle, because he leaves so much out in his style, is a whole new layer of difficulty. One explanation is what survived as texts of Aristotle was simply lecture notes. They weren't, in fact, even intended for publication. The other theories, they were deliberately obscure because we don't want just any Tom, Dick or Harry understanding the divine Aristotle. It should be reserved only for the most intelligent people in the room. Well, whatever the reason, these people found themselves given the job of having to explain the Nicomachean Ethics to undergraduates in Oxford sufficiently well for them to produce good exam answers in the exams. And the leading thinker behind this book was a very interesting figure called Walter Mooney Hatch. He was very clever. He won scholarships and arrived in Oxford as an undergraduate in the 1860s. And he became a fellow of New College. And his main interest was education. And he decided that the way to make Aristotle available to everyone was to expand massively what the text of Aristotle said. So his translations were imbued with what he called metaphysical imagination. And so if you compare his translation with the Aristotle text, you'll find that there's a whole lot of 19th century moral thought has been imported into the work. And he was working on this for some time after he'd left Oxford, in fact, and was busy setting up schools and teaching teaching and running schools, because he was also a headmaster, and then preaching sermons in the chapel. And he got into financial difficulties because there were a lot of start-up schools at the time. It became very fashionable, or not fashionable, but it became very attractive to the zeitgeist to be producing these schools, because there was a sudden demand for education. It wasn't just the great public schools that could produce this education. One also wanted other schools, so people had lots of choice. But in fact, it all went badly wrong for Hatch, and his school he tried to set up in Knutsford in Cheshire went bust, and he ended up having to mortgage his fellowship at New College. So he didn't have any money from that, and then New College arranged for him to become a rector, because he was ordained, at Birchanger in Essex. And then on Advent Sunday 1877, he, after preaching 2 amazing sermons, he dropped dead with, I don't know, nervous exhaustion. His heart gave out, but he was only 33. And this amazing book was not finished. He'd managed to do 6 out of the 10 books of the Nicomachean Ethics. And his brother Edwin thought that this was such a wonderful book that it had to be finished. And he roped in 2 other members of the New College Common Room, William Archibald Spooner and Edmund Morshed, and that they did the other books. So, where is this all going? It's an amazing book, because even though you had 3 different people producing it, they seem to have a very clear conception of what Aristotle meant. And it seems to be a sort of version of moral philosophy that is not a million miles away from the other things that people were reading in 19th century Oxford. And in particular, for students doing classics, they would be reading Bishop Butler's sermons. So that's a major point of affinity with the fact that the Moral Philosophy of Aristotle. And the other big influence was Immanuel Kant. So it's very worth studying this book in detail, not just because their views of Aristotle are still worth considering today. That their version of Aristotle is totally imbued with all the insights of the ancient tradition. They even include a translation of an ancient paraphrase, which Hatch thought was possibly very early on in the production of Aristotle's texts, but most people now think it was actually a Christian version produced in the 14th century in Byzantium. So they've got all this religious view of Aristotle, which is very firmly within the tradition. So it's well worth looking at as a way of understanding Aristotle from within a Christian tradition. But it's also, even if you think it's completely misguided and wrong as a translation of Aristotle, it's still worth reading because it tells you so much about how Victorian teachers of Aristotle, or indeed Victorian members of Oxford University in the 19th century, when there was so much religious disagreement going on, how they were thinking about morality. And that is taking you, in a way, in the direction of what happened to moral philosophy later on in Oxford in the 20th century. So it's got all those things to make it worth studying. And that is really the message I'm trying to deliver today. That's it. Thank you.